Menexenus. Menexenus is, in the main, a parody of the Athenian funeral oration. The funeral oration was an important form in Athens, though few extant examples remain. So even a parody as given here is an important source of the style. Questions remain whether Menexenus was written by Plato. The support is given by Aristotle. Persons of the dialogue: Socrates, Menexenus.
Whence come you, Menexenus? Are you from the Agora?
Yes, Socrates. I have been at the council.
And what might you have been doing at the council? And yet I need hardly ask, for I see that you, believing yourself to have arrived at the end of education and of philosophy, and to have had enough of them, are mounting upwards to things higher still, and, though rather young for the post, are intending to govern us elder men, like the rest of your family, which has always provided someone who kindly took care of us.
Yes, Socrates, I shall be ready to hold office if you allow and advise that I should, but not if you think otherwise. I went to the council chamber because I heard that the council was about to choose someone who was to speak over the dead. For you know that there is to be a public funeral.
Yes, I know. And whom did they choose?
No one. They delayed the election until tomorrow, but I believe that either Archinus or Dion will be chosen.
Oh, Menexenus, death in battle is certainly in many respects a noble thing. The dead man gets a fine and costly funeral, although he may have been poor, and an elaborate speech is made over him by a wise man who has long ago prepared what he has to say, although he who is praised may not have been good for much. The speakers praise him for what he has done and for what he has not done. That is the beauty of them, and they steal away our souls with their embellished words. In every conceivable form they praise the city, and they praise those who died in war, and all our ancestors who went before us, and they praise ourselves also, who are still alive, until I feel quite elevated by their laudations, and I stand listening to their words, Menexenus, and become enchanted by them, and all in a moment I imagine myself to have become a greater and nobler and finer man than I was before. And if, as often happens, there are any foreigners who accompany me to the speech, I become suddenly conscious of having a sort of triumph over them, and they seem to experience a corresponding feeling of admiration at me, and at the greatness of the city, which appears to them, when they are under the influence of the speaker, more wonderful than ever. This consciousness of dignity lasts me more than 3 days, and not until the 4th or 5th day do I come to my senses and know where I am. In the meantime, I have been living in the islands of the blessed. Such is the art of our rhetoricians, and in such manner does the sound of their words keep ringing in my ears.
You are always making fun of the rhetoricians, Socrates. This time, however, I am inclined to think that the speaker who is chosen will not have much to say, for he has been called upon to speak at a moment's notice, and he will be compelled almost to improvise.
But why, my friend, should he not have plenty to say? Every rhetorician has speeches ready-made, nor is there any difficulty in improvising that sort of stuff. Had the orator to praise Athenians among Peloponnesians, or Peloponnesians among Athenians, he must be a good rhetorician who could succeed and gain credit. But there is no difficulty in a man's winning applause when he is contending for fame among the persons whom he is praising.
Do you think not, Socrates?
Certainly not.
Do you think that you could speak yourself, if there should be a necessity, and if the council were to choose you?
That I should be able to speak is no great wonder, Menexenus, considering that I have an excellent mistress in the art of rhetoric, she who has made so many good speakers, and one who was the best among all the Hellenes, Pericles, the son of Xanthippus.
And who is she? I suppose you mean Aspasia?
Yes, I do. And besides her, I had Conus, the son of Metrobius, as a master, and he was my master in music, as she was in rhetoric. No wonder that a man who has received such an education should be a finished speaker, even the pupil of very inferior masters. Say, for example, one who had learned music of Lamprus and rhetoric of Antiphon the Ramnusian might make a figure if he were to praise the Athenians among the Athenians.
And what would you be able to say if you had to speak?
Of my own wits, most likely nothing. But yesterday I heard Aspasia composing a funeral oration about these very dead, for she had been told, as you were saying, that the Athenians were going to choose a speaker, and she repeated to me the sort of speech which he should deliver, partly improvising and partly from previous thought, putting together fragments of the funeral oration which Pericles spoke, but which, as I believe, she composed.
And can you remember what Aspasia said?
I ought to be able, for she taught me, and she was ready to strike me because I was always forgetting.
Then why will you not rehearse what she said?
Because I'm afraid that my mistress may be angry with me if I publish her speech.
Nay, Socrates, let us have the speech, whether Aspasia's or anyone else's, no matter. I hope that you will oblige me.
But I'm afraid that you will laugh at me if I continue the games of youth in old age.
Far otherwise, Socrates. Let us by all means have the speech.
Truly, I have such a disposition to oblige you that if you bid me dance naked, I should not like to refuse, since we are alone. Listen then, if I remember rightly, she began as follows, with the mention of the dead. There is a tribute of deeds and of words. The departed have already had the first. When going forth on their destined journey, they were attended on their way by the state and by their friends. The tribute of words remains to be given to them, as is meet and by law ordained. For noble words are a memorial and a crown of noble actions, which are given to the doers of them by the hearers. A word is needed which will duly praise the dead and gently admonish the living, exhorting the brethren and descendants of the departed to imitate their virtue, and consoling their fathers and mothers, and the survivors, if any, who may chance to be alive of the previous generation. What sort of a word will this be, and how shall we rightly begin the praises of these brave men? In their life they rejoiced their own friends with their valour, and their death they gave in exchange for the salvation of the living. And I think that we should praise them in the order in which nature made them good, for they were good because they were sprung from good fathers. Wherefore, let us first of all praise the goodness of their birth, secondly their nurture and education, and then let us set forth how noble their actions were, and how worthy of the education which they had received. And first, as to their birth. Their ancestors were not strangers, nor are these their descendants, sojourners only, whose fathers have come from another country, but they are the children of the soil, dwelling and living in their own land. And the country which brought them up is not like other countries, a stepmother to her children, but their own true mother. She bore them and nourished them and received them, and in her bosom they now repose. It is meet and right, therefore, that we should begin by praising the land, which is their mother, and that will be a way of praising their noble birth. The country is worthy to be praised, not only by us, but by all mankind, first and above all, as being dear to the gods. This is proved by the strife and contention of the gods respecting her, and ought not the country which the gods praise to be praised by all mankind? The second praise, which may be fairly claimed by her, is that at the time when the whole earth was sending forth and creating diverse animals, tame and wild, she, our mother, was free and pure from savage monsters, and out of all animals selected and brought forth man, who is superior to the rest in understanding, and alone has justice and religion. And a great proof that she brought forth the common ancestors of us and of the departed is that she provided the means of support for her offspring. For, as a woman proves her motherhood by giving milk to her young ones, and she who has no fountain of milk is not a mother, so did this, our land, prove that she was the mother of men. For in those days she alone, and first of all, brought forth wheat and barley for human food, which is the best and noblest sustenance for man, whom she regarded as her true offspring. And these are truer proofs of motherhood in a country than in a woman, for the woman, in her conception and generation, is but the imitation of the earth, and not the earth of the woman. And of the fruit of the earth she gave a plenteous supply, not only to her own, but to others also. And afterwards she made the olive to spring up, to be a boon to her children, and to help them in their toils. And when she had herself nursed them and brought them up to manhood, she gave them gods to be their rulers and teachers, whose names are well known, and need not now be repeated. They are the gods who first ordered our lives, and instructed us in the arts for the supply of our daily needs, and taught us the acquisition and use of arms for the defence of the country. Thus born into the world, and thus educated, the ancestors of the departed lived and made themselves a government, which I ought briefly to commemorate. For government is the nurture of man, and the government of good men is good, and of bad men bad. And I must show that our ancestors were trained under a good government, and for this reason they were good, and our contemporaries are also good, among whom our departed friends are to be reckoned. Then, as now, and indeed always, from that time to this, speaking generally, our government was an aristocracy, a form of government which receives various names according to the fancies of men, and is sometimes called democracy, but is really an aristocracy, or government of the best, which has the approval of the many. For kings we have always had, first hereditary and then elected, and authority is mostly in the hands of the people, who dispense offices and power to those who appear to be the most deserving of them. Neither is a man rejected from weakness or poverty or obscurity of origin, nor honoured by reason of the opposite, as in other states, but there is one principle: he who appears to be wise and good is a governor and ruler. The basis of this, our government, is equality of birth. For other states are made up of all sorts and unequal conditions of men, and therefore their governments are unequal. There are tyrannies and there are oligarchies, in which the one party are slaves and the others masters. But we and our citizens are brethren, the children all of one mother, and we do not think it right to be one another's masters or servants, but the natural equality of birth compels us to seek for legal equality and to recognize no superiority except in the reputation of virtue and wisdom. And so their and our fathers, and these too, our brethren, being nobly born and having been brought up in all freedom, did both in their public and private capacity many noble deeds, famous over the whole world. They were the deeds of men who thought that they ought to fight both against Hellenes for the sake of Hellenes on behalf of freedom, and against barbarians in the common interest of Hellas. Time would fail me to tell of their defence of their country against the invasion of Eumolpus and the Amazons, or of their defence of the Argives against the Cadmeans, or of the Heraclids against the Argives. Besides, the poets have already declared in song to all mankind their glory, and therefore any commemoration of their deeds in prose, which we might attempt, would hold a second place. They already have their reward, and I say no more of them. But there are other worthy deeds of which no poet has worthily sung, and which are still wooing the poet's muse. Of these I am bound to make honourable mention, and shall invoke others to sing of them also in lyric and other strains, in a manner becoming the actors. And first, I will tell how the Persians, lords of Asia, were enslaving Europe, and how the children of this land, who were our fathers, held them back. Of these I will speak first, and praise their valour, as is meet and fitting. He who would rightly estimate them should place himself in thought at that time when the whole of Asia was subject to the third king of Persia. The first king, Cyrus, by his valour freed the Persians, who were his countrymen, and subjected the Medes, who were their lords, and he ruled over the rest of Asia as far as Egypt. And after him came his son, who ruled all the accessible part of Egypt and Libya. The third king was Darius, who extended the land boundaries of the empire to Scythia, and with his fleet held the sea and the islands. None presumed to be his equal. The minds of all men were enthralled by him. So many and mighty and warlike nations had the power of Persia subdued. Now Darius had a quarrel against us and the Eretrians, because, as he said, we had conspired against Sardis, and he sent 500,000 men in transports and vessels of war, and 300 ships, and Datis as commander, telling him to bring the Eretrians and Athenians to the king, if he wished to keep his head on his shoulders. He sailed against the Eretrians, who were reputed to be amongst the noblest and most warlike of the Hellenes of that day, and they were numerous, but he conquered them all in 3 days. And when he had conquered them, in order that no one might escape, he searched the whole country after this manner. His soldiers, coming to the borders of Eretria and spreading from sea to sea, joined hands and passed through the whole country in order that they might be able to tell the king that no one had escaped them. And from Eretria they went to Marathon with a like intention, expecting to bind the Athenians in the same yoke of necessity in which they had bound the Eretrians. Having effected one half of their purpose, they were in the act of attempting the other, and none of the Hellenes dared to assist either the Eretrians or the Athenians, except the Lacedaemonians, and they arrived a day too late for the battle, but the rest were panic-stricken and kept quiet, too happy in having escaped for a time. He who has present to his mind that conflict will know what manner of men they were who received the onset of the barbarians at Marathon, and chastened the pride of the whole of Asia, and by the victory which they gained over the barbarians, first taught other men that the power of the Persians was not invincible, but that hosts of men and the multitude of riches alike yield to valour. And I assert that those men are the fathers not only of ourselves, but of our liberties, and of the liberties of all who are on the continent, for that was the action to which the Hellenes looked back when they ventured to fight for their own safety in the battles which ensued. They became disciples of the men of Marathon. To them, therefore, I assign in my speech the first place. And second, to those who fought and conquered in the sea fights at Salamis and Artemisium, for of them too one might have many things to say, of the assaults which they endured by sea and land, and how they repelled them. I will mention only that act of theirs which appears to me to be the noblest, and which followed that of Marathon, and came nearest to it. For the men of Marathon only showed the Hellenes that it was possible to ward off the barbarians by land, the many by the few, but there was no proof that they could be defeated by ships, and at sea the Persians retained the reputation of being invincible in numbers and wealth and skill and strength. This is the glory of the men who fought at sea, that they dispelled the second terror which had hitherto possessed the Hellenes, and so made the fear of numbers, whether of ships or men, to cease among them. And so the soldiers of Marathon and the sailors of Salamis became the schoolmasters of Hellas, the one teaching and habituating the Hellenes not to fear the barbarians at sea, and the others not to fear them by land. Third in order for the number and valour of the combatants, and third in the salvation of Hellas, I place the battle of Plataea. And now the Lacedaemonians, as well as the Athenians, took part in the struggle. They were all united in this greatest and most terrible conflict of all, wherefore their virtues will be celebrated in times to come, as they are now celebrated by us. But at a later period, many Hellenic tribes were still on the side of the barbarians, and there was a report that the great king was going to make a new attempt upon the Hellenes, and therefore justice requires that we should also make mention of those who crowned the previous work of our salvation and drove and purged away all barbarians from the sea. These were the men who fought by sea at the river Eurymedon, and who went on the expedition to Cyprus, and who sailed to Egypt and divers other places, and they should be gratefully remembered by us, because they compelled the king in fear for himself to look to his own safety, instead of plotting the destruction of Hellas. And so the war against the barbarians was fought out to the end by the whole city on their own behalf and on behalf of their countrymen. There was peace, and our city was held in honour. And then, as prosperity makes men jealous, there succeeded a jealousy of her, and jealousy begat envy, and so she became engaged against her will in a war with the Hellenes. On the breaking out of war, our citizens met the Lacedaemonians at Tanagra and fought for the freedom of the Boeotians. The issue was doubtful, and was decided by the engagement which followed. For when the Lacedaemonians had gone on their way, leaving the Boeotians whom they were aiding, on the third day after the battle of Tanagra, our countrymen conquered at Oenophyta, and righteously restored those who had been unrighteously exiled. And they were the first, after the Persian War, who fought on behalf of liberty in aid of Hellenes against Hellenes. They were brave men, and freed those whom they aided, and were the first too who were honourably interred in this sepulchre by the state. Afterwards, there was a mighty war, in which all the Hellenes joined, and devastated our country, which was very ungrateful of them, and our countrymen, after defeating them in a naval engagement, and taking their leaders, the Spartans at Sphagia, when they might have destroyed them, spared their lives, and gave them back, and made peace, considering that they should war with the fellow countrymen only until they gained a victory over them, and not because of the private anger of the state destroy the common interest of Hellas, but that with barbarians they should war to the death. Worthy of praise are they also who waged this war, and are here interred. For they proved, if anyone doubted the superior prowess of the Athenians in the former war with the barbarians, that their doubts had no foundation, showing by their victory in the civil war with Hellas, in which they subdued the other chief state of the Hellenes, that they could conquer single-handed those with whom they had been allied in the war against the barbarians. After the peace, there followed a third war, which was of a terrible and desperate nature, and in this many brave men, who are here interred, lost their lives. Many of them had won victories in Sicily, whither they had gone over the seas to fight for the liberties of the Leontines, to whom they were bound by oaths. But, owing to the distance, the city was unable to help them, and they lost heart and came to misfortune, their very enemies and opponents winning more renown for valour and temperance than the friends of others. Many also fell in naval engagements at the Hellespont, after having in one day taken all the ships of the enemy and defeated them in other naval engagements. And what I call the terrible and desperate nature of the war is that the other Hellenes, in their extreme animosity towards the city, should have entered into negotiations with their bitterest enemy, the king of Persia, whom they, together with us, had expelled. Him, without us, they again brought back, barbarian against Hellenes, and all the hosts, both of Hellenes and barbarians, were united against Athens. And then shone forth the power and valour of our city. Her enemies had supposed that she was exhausted by the war, and our ships were blockaded at Mytilene, but the citizens themselves embarked and came to the rescue with 60 other ships, and their valour was confessed of all men, for they conquered their enemies and delivered their friends. And yet, by some evil fortune, they were left to perish at sea, and therefore are not interred here. Ever to be remembered and honoured are they, for by their valour not only that sea fight was won for us, but the entire war was decided by them, and through them the city gained the reputation of being invincible, even though attacked by all mankind. And that reputation was a true one, for the defeat which came upon us was our own doing. We were never conquered by others, and to this day we are still unconquered by them, but we were our own conquerors, and received defeat at our own hands. Afterwards there was quiet and peace abroad, but there sprang up war at home, and if men are destined to have civil war, no one could have desired that his city should take the disorder in a milder form. How joyful and natural was the reconciliation of those who came from the Piraeus and those who came from the city! With what moderation did they order the war against the tyrants in Eleusis, and in a manner how unlike what the other Hellenes expected! And the reason of this gentleness was the veritable tie of blood, which created among them a friendship, as of kinsmen, faithful not in word only, but in deed. And we ought also to remember those who then fell by one another's hands, and on such occasions as these to reconcile them with sacrifices and prayers, praying to those who have power over them, that they may be reconciled, even as we are reconciled. For they did not attack one another out of malice or enmity, but they were unfortunate. And that such was the fact, we ourselves are witnesses, who are of the same race with them, and have mutually received and granted forgiveness of what we have done and suffered. After this there was perfect peace, and the city had rest. And her feeling was that she forgave the barbarians, who had severely suffered at her hands, and severely retaliated, but that she was indignant at the ingratitude of the Hellenes, when she remembered how they had received good from her, and returned evil, having made common cause with the barbarians, depriving her of the ships which had once been their salvation, and dismantling our walls, which had preserved their own from falling. She thought that she would no longer defend the Hellenes when enslaved either by one another or by the barbarians, and did accordingly. This was our feeling, while the Lacedaemonians were thinking that we, who were the champions of liberty, had fallen, and that their business was to subject the remaining Hellenes. And why should I say more? For the events of which I am speaking happened not long ago, and we can all of us remember how the chief peoples of Hellas, Argives, and Boeotians, and Corinthians came to feel the need of us, and, what is the greatest miracle of all, the Persian king himself was driven to such extremity as to come round to the opinion that from this city, of which he was the destroyer, and from no other, his salvation would proceed. And if a person desired to bring a deserved accusation against our city, he would find only one charge which he could justly urge, that she was too compassionate and too favourable to the weaker side. And, in this instance, she was not able to hold out or keep her resolution of refusing aid to her injurers when they were being enslaved, but she was softened, and did, in fact, send out aid, and delivered the Hellenes from slavery, and they were free, until they afterwards enslaved themselves. Whereas, to the great king, she refused to give the assistance of the state, for she could not forget the trophies of Marathon and Salamis and Plataea, but she allowed exiles and volunteers to assist him, and they were his salvation. And she herself, when she was compelled, entered into the war, and built walls and ships, and fought with the Lacedaemonians on behalf of the Parians. Now the king, fearing this city and wanting to stand aloof, when he saw the Lacedaemonians growing weary of the war at sea, asked of us, as the price of his alliance with us and the other allies, to give up the Hellenes in Asia, whom the Lacedaemonians had previously handed over to him, he thinking that we should refuse, and that then he might have a pretence for withdrawing from us. About the other allies he was mistaken, for the Corinthians and Argives and Boeotians and the other states were quite willing to let them go, and swore and covenanted that if he would pay them money they would make over to him the Hellenes of the continent, and we alone refused to give them up and swear. Such was the natural nobility of this city. So sound and healthy was the spirit of freedom among us, and the instinctive dislike of the barbarian, because we are pure Hellenes, having no admixture of barbarism in us. For we are not like the many others, descendants of Pelops or Cadmus or Egyptus or Danaus, who are by nature barbarians and yet pass for Hellenes and dwell in the midst of us, but we are pure Hellenes, uncontaminated by any foreign element, and therefore the hatred of the foreigner has passed unadulterated into the lifeblood of the city. And so, notwithstanding our noble sentiments, we were again isolated, because we were unwilling to be guilty of the base and unholy act of giving up Hellenes to barbarians. And we were in the same case as when we were subdued before, but by the favour of heaven we managed better, for we ended the war without the loss of our ships or walls or colonies. The enemy was only too glad to be quit of us. Yet in this war we lost many brave men, such as were those who fell owing to the ruggedness of the ground at the Battle of Corinth, or by treason at Lycaeum. Brave men, too, were those who delivered the Persian king and drove the Lacedaemonians from the sea. I remind you of them, and you must celebrate them together with me, and do honour to their memories. Such were the actions of the men who are here interred, and of others who have died on behalf of their country. Many and glorious things I have spoken of them, and there are yet many more and more glorious things remaining to be told. Many days and nights would not suffice to tell of them. Let them not be forgotten, and let every man remind their descendants that they are also soldiers who must not desert the ranks of their ancestors, or from cowardice fall behind. Even as I exhort you this day, and in all future time, whenever I meet with any of you, shall continue to remind and exhort you, O ye sons of heroes, that you strive to be the bravest of men. And I think that I ought now to repeat what your fathers desired to have said to you, who are their survivors, when they went out to battle, in case anything happened to them. I will tell you what I heard them say, and what, if they had only speech, they would fain be saying, judging from what they then said. And you must imagine that you hear them saying what I now repeat to you. Sons, the event proves that your fathers were brave men, for we might have lived dishonourably, but have preferred to die honourably, rather than bring you and your children into disgrace, and rather than dishonour our own fathers and forefathers, considering that life is not life to one who is a dishonour to his race, and that to such a one neither men nor gods are friendly, either while he is on the earth or after death in the world below. Remember our words, then, and whatever is your aim, let virtue be the condition of the attainment of your aim, and know that without this all possessions and pursuits are dishonourable and evil. For neither does wealth bring honour to the owner, if he be a coward. Of such a one the wealth belongs to another, and not to himself. Nor does beauty and strength of body, when dwelling in a base and cowardly man, appear comely, but the reverse of comely, making the possessor more conspicuous, and manifesting forth his cowardice. And all knowledge, when separated from justice and virtue, is seen to be cunning, and not wisdom. Wherefore, make this your first and last and constant and all-absorbing aim, to exceed, if possible, not only us, but all your ancestors in virtue. And know that to excel you in virtue only brings us shame, but that to be excelled by you is a source of happiness to us. And we shall most likely be defeated, and you will most likely be victors in the contest if you learn so to order your lives as not to abuse or waste the reputation of your ancestors, knowing that to a man who has any self-respect, nothing is more dishonourable than to be honoured not for his own sake, but on account of the reputation of his ancestors. The honour of parents is a fair and noble treasure to their posterity, but to have the use of a treasure of wealth and honour, and to leave none to your successors, because you have neither money nor reputation of your own, is alike base and dishonourable. And if you follow our precepts, you will be received by us as friends when the hour of destiny brings you hither. But if you neglect our words, and are disgraced in your lives, no one will welcome or receive you. This is the message which is to be delivered to our children. Some of us have fathers and mothers still living, and we would urge them, if, as is likely, we shall die, to bear the calamity as lightly as possible, and not to condole with one another, for they have sorrows enough, and will not need anyone to stir them up. While we gently heal their wounds, let us remind them that the gods have heard the chief part of their prayers, for they prayed not that their children might live for ever, but that they might be brave and renowned. And this, which is the greatest good, they have attained. A mortal man cannot expect to have everything in his own life turning out according to his will, and they, if they bear their misfortunes bravely, will be truly deemed brave fathers of the brave. But if they give way to their sorrows, either they will be suspected of not being our parents, or we of not being such as our panegyrists declare. Let not either of the two alternatives happen, but rather let them be our chief and true panegyrists, who show in their lives that they are true men, and had men for their sons. Of old, the saying, "nothing too much," appeared to be, and really was, well said. For he whose happiness rests with himself, if possible, wholly, and if not, as far as is possible, who is not hanging in suspense on other men, or changing with the vicissitude of their fortune, has his life ordered for the best. He is the temperate and valiant and wise, and when his riches come and go, when his children are given and taken away, he will remember the proverb, neither rejoicing over much nor grieving over much, for he relies upon himself. And such we would have our parents to be, that is our word and wish, and as such we now offer ourselves, neither lamenting over much, nor fearing over much, if we are to die at this time. And we entreat our fathers and mothers to retain these feelings throughout their future life, and to be assured that they will not please us by sorrowing and lamenting over us. But if the dead have any knowledge of the living, they will displease us most by making themselves miserable, and by taking their misfortunes too much to heart, and they will please us best if they bear their loss lightly and temperately. For our life will have the noblest end which is vouchsafed to man, and should be glorified rather than lamented. And if they will direct their minds to the care and nurture of our wives and children, they will soonest forget their misfortunes, and live in a better and nobler way, and be dearer to us. This is all that we have to say to our families. And to the state we would say, take care of our parents and of our sons. Let her worthily cherish the old age of our parents, and bring up our sons in the right way. But we know that she will of her own accord take care of them, and does not need any exhortation of ours. This O ye children and parents of the dead, is the message which they bid us deliver to you, and which I do deliver with the utmost seriousness. And in their name I beseech you, the children, to imitate your fathers, and you, parents, to be of good cheer about yourselves, for we will nourish your age, and take care of you both publicly and privately in any place in which one of us may meet one of you who are the parents of the dead. And the care of you which the city shows, you know yourselves. For she has made provision by law concerning the parents and children of those who die in war. The highest authority is specially entrusted with the duty of watching over them above all other citizens, and they will see that your fathers and mothers have no wrong done to them. The city herself shares in the education of the children, desiring as far as it is possible that their orphanhood may not be felt by them. While they are children, she is a parent to them, and when they have arrived at man's estate, she sends them to their several duties, in full armour clad, and bringing freshly to their minds the ways of their fathers. She places in their hands the instruments of their fathers' virtues. For the sake of the omen, she would have them from the first to begin to rule over their own houses, arrayed in the strength and arms of their fathers. And as for the dead, she never ceases honouring them, celebrating in common for all rites which become the property of each, and, in addition to this, holding gymnastic and equestrian contests, and music festivals of every sort. She is to the dead in the place of a son and heir, and to their sons in the place of a father, and to their parents and elder kindred in the place of a guardian, ever and always caring for them. Considering this, you ought to bear your calamity the more gently, for thus you will be most endeared to the dead and to the living, and your sorrows will heal and be healed. And now do you and all, having lamented the dead in common according to the law, go your ways. You have heard, Menexenus, the oration of Aspasia the Milesian.
Truly, Socrates, I marvelled that Aspasia, who is only a woman, should be able to compose such a speech. She must be a rare one.
Well, if you're incredulous, you may come with me and hear her.
I have often met Aspasia, Socrates, and know what she is like.
Well, and do you not admire her? And are you not grateful for her speech?
Yes, Socrates, I am very grateful to her, or to him who told you, and still more to you who have told me.
Very good. But you must take care not to tell of me, and then at some future time I will repeat to you many other excellent political speeches of hers.
Fear not. Only let me hear them, and I will keep the secret.
Then I will keep my promise.
In Menexenus, Socrates was played by David Rintoul, and Menexenus by Rupert Farley. Ion, by Plato. Ion is one of the shortest of the dialogues, and does not have any early evidence that it is actually by Plato. But according to Benjamin Jowett, the grace and beauty of this little work supply the only, and perhaps a sufficient, proof of its genuineness. The plan is simple. The dramatic interest consists entirely in the contrast between the irony of Socrates and the transparent vanity and childlike enthusiasm of the rhapsode Ion. The role of the rhapsode or rhapsodist was to perform or declaim the Homeric epics. Persons of the dialogue: Socrates, Ion.
Welcome, Ion. Are you from your native city of Ephesus?
No, Socrates, but from Epidaurus, where I attended the festival of Asclepius.
And do the Epidaurians have contests of rhapsodes at the festival?
Oh, yes, and of all sorts of musical performers.
And were you one of the competitors? And did you succeed?
I obtained the first prize of all, Socrates.
Well done, and I hope that you will do the same for us at the Panathenaea.
And I will, please heaven.
I often envy the profession of a rhapsode, Ian, for you have always to wear fine clothes and to look as beautiful as you can as a part of your art. Then again, you are obliged to be continually in the company of many good poets, and especially of Homer, who is the best and most divine of them, and to understand him, and not merely learn his words by rote, is a thing greatly to be envied. And no man can be a rhapsode who does not understand the meaning of the poet, for the rhapsode ought to interpret the mind of the poet to his hearers. But how can he interpret him well unless he knows what he means? All this is greatly to be envied.
Very true, Socrates. Interpretation has certainly been the most laborious part of my art, and I believe myself able to speak about Homer better than any man, and that neither Metrodorus of Lampsacus, nor Stesimbrotus of Thasos, nor Glaucon, nor anyone else who ever was, had as good ideas about Homer as I have, or as many.
I am glad to hear you say so, Ion. I see that you will not refuse to acquaint me with them.
Certainly, Socrates. And you really ought to hear how exquisitely I render Homer. I think that the Homeridae should give me a golden crown.
I shall take an opportunity of hearing your embellishments of him at some other time. But just now I should like to ask you a question. Does your art extend to Hesiod and Archilochus, or to Homer only?
To Homer only. He is in himself quite enough.
Are there any things about which Homer and Hesiod agree?
Yes. In my opinion, there are a good many.
And can you interpret better what Homer says or what Hesiod says about these matters in which they agree?
I can interpret them equally well, Socrates, where they agree.
But what about matters in which they do not agree? For example, about divination, of which both Homer and Hesiod have something to say.
Very true.
Would you, or a good prophet, be a better interpreter of what these two poets say about divination, not only when they agree, but when they disagree?
A prophet.
And if you were a prophet, would you be able to interpret them when they disagree as well as when they agree?
Clearly.
But how did you come to have this skill about Homer only, and not about Hesiod or the other poets? Does not Homer speak of the same themes which all other poets handle? Is not war his great argument? And does he not speak of human society and of intercourse of men, good and bad, skilled and unskilled, and of the gods conversing with one another and with mankind, and about what happens in heaven and in the world below, and the generations of gods and heroes? Are not these the themes of which Homer sings?
Very true, Socrates.
And do not the other poets sing of the same?
Yes, Socrates, but not in the same way as Homer.
What, in a worse way?
Yes, in a far worse.
And Homer in a better way?
He is incomparably better.
And yet surely, my dear friend, Ion, in a discussion about arithmetic, where many people are speaking, and one speaks better than the rest, there is somebody who can judge which of them is the good speaker.
Yes.
And he who judges of the good will be the same as he who judges of the bad speakers.
The same.
And he will be the arithmetician?
Yes.
Well, and in discussions about the wholesomeness of food, when many persons are speaking, and one speaks better than the rest, will he who recognizes the better speaker be a different person from him who recognizes the worse, or the same?
Clearly the same.
And who is he, and what is his name?
The physician.
And speaking generally, in all discussions in which the subject is the same, and many men are speaking, will not he who knows the good know the bad speaker also? For if he does not know the bad, neither will he know the good when the same topic is being discussed.
True.
Is not the same person skillful in both?
Yes.
And you say that Homer and other poets, such as Hesiod and Archilochus, speak of the same things, although not in the same way. But the one speaks well, and the other not so well.
Yes, and I am right in saying so.
And if you knew the good speaker, you would also know the inferior speakers to be inferior.
That is true.
Then, my dear friend, can I be mistaken in saying that Ion is equally skilled in Homer and in other poets, since he himself acknowledges that the same person will be a good judge of all those who speak of the same things, and that almost all poets do speak of the same things.
Why then, Socrates, do I lose attention and go to sleep, and have absolutely no ideas of the least value when anyone speaks of any other poet? But when Homer is mentioned, I wake up at once and am all attention and have plenty to say.
The reason, my friend, is obvious. No one can fail to see that you speak of Homer without any art or knowledge. If you were able to speak of him by rules of art, you would have been able to speak of all the other poets, for poetry is a whole.
Yes.
And when anyone acquires any other art as a whole, the same may be said of them. Would you like me to explain my meaning, Ion?
Yes, indeed, Socrates. I very much wish that you would, for I love to hear you wise men talk.
Oh, that we were wise, Ion, and that you could truly call us so. But you rhapsodes and actors, and the poets whose verses you sing are wise, whereas I am a common man who only speak the truth. For consider what a very commonplace and trivial thing is this which I have said, a thing which any man might say, that when a man has acquired a knowledge of a whole art, the inquiry into good and bad is one and the same. Let us consider this matter. Is not the art of painting a whole?
Yes.
And there are, and have been, many painters, good and bad.
Yes.
And did you ever know anyone who was skillful in pointing out the excellences and defects of Polygnotus, the son of Aglaophon, but incapable of criticizing other painters, and when the work of any other painter was produced, went to sleep and was at a loss and had no ideas, but when he had to give his opinion about Polygnotus, or whoever the painter might be, and about him only, woke up and was attentive and had plenty to say?
No, indeed. I have never known such a person.
Or did you ever know of anyone in sculpture who was skillful in expounding the merits of Daedalus, the son of Metion, or of Epius, the son of Panopeus, or of Theodorus, the Samian, or of any individual sculptor, but when the works of sculptors in general were produced, was at a loss and went to sleep and had nothing to say?
No, indeed. No more than the other.
And if I am not mistaken, you never met with anyone among flute players or harp players or singers to the harp or rhapsodes who was able to discourse of Olympus or Thamyris or Orpheus or Phemius, the rhapsode of Ithaca, but was at a loss when he came to speak of Ion of Ephesus and had no notion of his merits or defects?
I cannot deny what you say, Socrates. Nevertheless, I am conscious in my own self, and the world agrees with me in thinking that I do speak better and have more to say about Homer than any other man. But I do not speak equally well about others. Tell me the reason for this.
I perceive, Ion, and I will proceed to explain to you what I imagine to be the reason for this. The gift which you possess of speaking excellently about Homer is not an art, but, as I was just saying, an inspiration. There is a divinity moving you, like that contained in the stone, which Euripides calls a magnet, but which is commonly known as the stone of Heraclea. This stone not only attracts iron rings, but also imparts to them a similar power of attracting other rings. And sometimes you may see a number of pieces of iron and rings suspended from one another, so as to form quite a long chain, and all of them derive their power of suspension from the original stone. In like manner, the Muse first of all inspires men herself, and from these inspired persons a chain of other persons is suspended who take the inspiration. For all good poets, epic as well as lyric, compose their beautiful poems not by art, but because they are inspired and possessed. And as the Corybantian revellers, when they dance, are not in their right mind, so the lyric poets are not in their right mind when they are composing their beautiful strains. But when falling under the power of music and metre, they are inspired and possessed, like Bacchic maidens who draw milk and honey from the rivers when they are under the influence of Dionysus, but not when they are in their right mind. And the soul of the lyric poet does the same, as they themselves say, for they tell us that they bring songs from honeyed fountains, culling them out of the gardens and dells of the muses, they, like the bees, winging their way from flower to flower. And this is true, for the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses, and the mind is no longer in him. When he has not attained to this state, he is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles. Many are the noble words in which poets speak concerning the actions of men, but like yourself, when speaking about Homer, they do not speak of them by any rules of art. They are simply inspired to utter that to which the muse impels them, and that only. And when inspired, one of them will make dithyrambs, another hymns of praise, another choral strains, another epic or iambic verses, and he who is good at one is not good at any other kind of verse. For not by art does the poet sing, but by power divine. Had he learned by rules of art, he would have known how to speak not of one theme only, but of all, and therefore God takes away the minds of poets and uses them as his ministers, as he also uses diviners and holy prophets, in order that we who hear them may know them to be speaking not of themselves, who utter these priceless words in a state of unconsciousness, but that God himself is the speaker, and that through them he is conversing with us. Antinicus the Chalcidian affords a striking instance of what I am saying. He wrote nothing that anyone would care to remember but the famous paean, which is in everyone's mouth, one of the finest poems ever written, simply an invention of the muses, as he himself says. For in this way the god would seem to indicate to us, and not allow us to doubt, that these beautiful poems are not human, or the work of man, but divine, and the work of God, and that the poets are only the interpreters of the gods by whom they are severally possessed. Was not this the lesson which the god intended to teach when, by the mouth of the worst of poets, he sang the best of songs? Am I not right, Ion?
Yes, indeed, Socrates. I feel that you are. For your words touch my soul, and I am persuaded that good poets, by a divine inspiration, interpret the things of the gods to us.
And you rhapsodists are the interpreters of the poets.
There again you are right.
Then you are the interpreters of interpreters.
Precisely.
I wish you would frankly tell me, Ion, what I'm going to ask of you. When you produce the greatest effect upon the audience in the recitation of some striking passage, such as the apparition of Odysseus leaping forth on the floor, recognized by the suitors and casting his arrows at his feet, or the description of Achilles rushing at Hector, or of the sorrows of Andromache, Hecuba, or Priam, are you in your right mind? Are you not carried out of yourself, and does not your soul in an ecstasy seem to be among the persons or places of which you are speaking, whether they are in Ithaca or in Troy or whatever may be the scene of the poem?
That proof strikes home to me, Socrates, for I must frankly confess that at the tale of pity, my eyes are filled with tears, and when I speak of horrors, my hair stands on end and my heart throbs.
Well, Ion, and what are we to say of a man who, at a sacrifice or festival, when he is dressed in holiday attire and has golden crowns upon his head, of which nobody has robbed him, appears sweeping or panic-stricken in the presence of more than 20,000 friendly faces, when there is no one despoiling or wronging him? Is he in his right mind, or is he not?
No, indeed, Socrates, I must say that, strictly speaking, he is not in his right mind.
And are you aware that you produce similar effects on most spectators?
Only too well, for I look down upon them from the stage and behold the various emotions of pity, wonder, sternness stamped upon their countenances when I am speaking, and I am obliged to give my very best attention to them. For if I make them cry, I myself shall laugh, and if I make them laugh, I myself shall cry when the time of payment arrives.
Do you know that the spectator is the last of the rings which, as I am saying, receive the power of the original magnet from one another? The rhapsode, like yourself, and the actor are intermediate links, and the poet himself is the first of them. Through all these, the god sways the souls of men in any direction which he pleases, and makes one man hang down from another. Thus, there is a vast chain of dancers and masters and undermasters of choruses who are suspended, as if from the stone, at the side of the rings which hang down from the muse. And every poet has some muse from whom he is suspended, and by whom he is said to be possessed, which is nearly the same thing, for he is taken hold of. And from these first rings, which are the poets, depend others, some deriving their inspiration from Orpheus, others from Musaeus, but the greater number are possessed and held by Homer, of whom, Ion, you are one, and are possessed by Homer. And when anyone repeats the words of another poet, you go to sleep, and know not what to say. But when anyone recites a strain of Homer, you wake up in a moment, and your soul leaps within you, and you have plenty to say. For not by art or knowledge about Homer do you say what you say, but by divine inspiration and by possession, just as the Corybantian revellers too have a quick perception of that strain, only which is appropriated to the god by whom they are possessed, and have plenty of dances and words for that, but take no heed of any other. And you, Ion, when the name of Homer is mentioned, have plenty to say, and have nothing to say of others. You ask, why is this? The answer is that you praise Homer not by art, but by divine inspiration.
That is good, Socrates. And yet I doubt whether you will ever have eloquence enough to persuade me that I praise Homer only when I am mad and possessed. And if you could hear me speak of him, I am sure you would never think this to be the case.
I should like very much to hear you, but not until you have answered a question which I have to ask. On what part of Homer do you speak well? Not surely about every part.
There is no part, Socrates, about which I do not speak well, of that I can assure you.
Surely not about things in Homer of which you have no knowledge.
And what is there in Homer of which I have no knowledge?
Why does not Homer speak in many passages about arts? For example, about driving. If I can only remember the lines, I'll repeat them.
I remember and will repeat them.
Tell me then what Nestor says to Antilochus, his son, where he bids him be careful of the turn at the horse race in honour of Patroclus.
He says, "Bend gently in the polished chariot to the left of them, and urge the horse on the right hand with whip and voice, and slacken the rein. And when you are at the goal, let the left horse draw near, yet so that the nave of the well-wrought wheel may not even seem to touch the extremity, and avoid catching the stone."
Enough. Now, Ion, will the charioteer or the physician be the better judge of the propriety of these lines?
The charioteer, clearly.
And will the reason be that this is his art, or will there be any other reason?
No, that will be the reason.
And every art is appointed by God to have knowledge of a certain work. For that which we know by the art of the pilot, we do not know by the art of medicine.
Certainly not.
Nor do we know by the art of the carpenter that which we know by the art of medicine.
Certainly not.
And this is true of all the arts. That which we know with one art, we do not know with the other. But let me ask a prior question. You admit that there are differences of arts.
Yes.
You would argue, as I should, that when one art is of one kind of knowledge and another of another, they are different.
Yes.
Yes, surely. For if the subject of knowledge were the same, there would be no meaning in saying that the arts were different, if they both gave the same knowledge. For example, I know that here are 5 fingers, and you know the same, and if I were to ask whether I and you became acquainted with this fact by the help of the same art of arithmetic, you would acknowledge that we did.
Yes.
Tell me then, what I was intending to ask you, whether this holds universally. Must the same art have the same subject of knowledge, and different arts other subjects of knowledge?
That is my opinion, Socrates.
Then he who has no knowledge of a particular art will have no right judgment of the sayings and doings of that art.
Very true.
Then which will be a better judge of the lines which you were reciting from Homer, you or the charioteer?
The charioteer.
Why, yes, because you are a rhapsode and not a charioteer.
Yes.
And the art of the rhapsode is different from that of the charioteer.
Yes.
And if a different knowledge, then a knowledge of different matters?
True.
You know the passage in which Hecamede, the concubine of Nestor, is described as giving to the wounded Macaon a posset, as he says, made with Pramnian wine, and she grated cheese of goat's milk with a grater of bronze, and at his side placed an onion, which gives a relish to drink. Now, would you say that the art of the rhapsode or the art of medicine was better able to judge of the propriety of these lines?
The art of medicine.
And when Homer says, "And she descended into the deep like a leaden plummet, which, set in the horn of ox that ranges in the fields, rushes along, carrying death among the ravenous fishes," will the art of the fisherman or of the rhapsode be better able to judge whether these lines are rightly expressed or not?
Clearly, Socrates, the art of the fisherman.
Come now, suppose that you were to say to me, "Since you, Socrates, are able to assign different passages in Homer to their corresponding arts, I wish that you would tell me what are the passages of which the excellence ought to be judged by the prophet and prophetic art, and you will see how readily and truly I shall answer you. For there are many such passages, particularly in the Odyssey, as, for example, the passage in which Theoclymenus, the prophet of the house of Melampus, says to the suitors, 'Wretched men, what is happening to you? Your heads and your faces and your limbs underneath are shrouded in night, and the voice of lamentation bursts forth, and your cheeks are wet with tears, and the vestibule is full, and the court is full of ghosts descending into the darkness of Erebus, and the sun has perished out of heaven, and an evil mist is spread abroad.'" And there are many such passages in the Iliad also, as, for example, in the description of the battle near the rampart, where he says, "As they were eager to pass the ditch, there came to them an omen. A soaring eagle, holding back the people on the left, bore a huge bloody dragon in his talons, still living and panting, nor had he yet resigned the strife, for he bent back and smote the bird which carried him on the breast by the neck, and he, in pain, let him fall from him to the ground into the midst of the multitude, and the eagle with a cry was borne afar on the wings of the wind." These are the sort of things which I should say that the prophet ought to consider and determine.
And you are quite right, Socrates, in saying so.
Yes, Ion, and you are right also. And as I have selected from the Iliad and Odyssey for you passages which describe the office of the prophet and the physician and the fisherman, do you, who know Homer so much better than I do, Ion, select for me passages which relate to the rhapsode and the rhapsode's art, and which the rhapsode ought to examine and judge of better than other men.
All passages, I should say, Socrates.
Not all, Ion, surely. Have you already forgotten what you are saying? A rhapsode ought to have a better memory.
Why? What am I forgetting?
Do you not remember that you declared the art of the rhapsode to be different from the art of the charioteer?
Yes, I remember.
And you admitted that being different, they would have different subjects of knowledge.
Yes.
Then upon your own showing, the rhapsode and the art of the rhapsode will not know everything.
I should exclude certain things, Socrates.
You mean to say that you would exclude pretty much the subjects of the other arts? As he does not know all of them, which of them will he know?
He will know what a man and what a woman ought to say, and what a freeman and what a slave ought to say, and what a ruler and what a subject.
Do you mean that a rhapsode will know better than the pilot what the ruler of a sea-tossed vessel ought to say?
No, the pilot will know best.
Or will the rhapsode know better than the physician what the ruler of a sick man ought to say?
He will not.
But he will know what a slave ought to say?
Yes.
Suppose the slave to be a cowherd. The rhapsode will know better than the cowherd what he ought to say in order to soothe the infuriated cows?
No, he will not.
But he will know what a spinning woman ought to say about the working of wool?
No.
At any rate, he will know what a general ought to say when exhorting his soldiers?
Yes, that is the sort of thing which the rhapsode will be sure to know.
Well, but is the art of the rhapsode the art of the general?
I am sure that I should know what a general ought to say.
Why, yes, Ion, because you may possibly have a knowledge of the art of the general as well as of the rhapsode, and you may also have a knowledge of horsemanship as well as of the lyre, and then you would know when horses were well or ill managed. But Suppose I were to ask you, by the help of which art, Ion, do you know whether horses are well managed, by your skill as a horseman or as a performer on the lyre? What would you answer?
I should reply by my skill as a horseman.
And if you judged of performers on the lyre, you would admit that you judged of them as a performer on the lyre, and not as a horseman.
Yes.
And in judging of the general's art, do you judge of it as a general or a rhapsode?
To me, there appears to be no difference between them.
What do you mean? Do you mean to say that the art of the rhapsode and of the general is the same?
Yes, one and the same.
Then he who is a good rhapsode is also a good general?
Certainly, Socrates.
And he who is a good general is also a good rhapsode?
No, I do not say that.
But you do say that he who is a good rhapsode is also a good general?
Certainly.
And you are the best of Hellenic rhapsodes?
Far the best, Socrates.
And are you the best general, Ion?
To be sure, Socrates, and Homer was my master.
But then, Ion, what in the name of goodness can be the reason why you, who are the best of generals as well as the best of rhapsodes in all Hellas, go about as a rhapsode when you might be a general? Do you think that the Hellenes want a rhapsode with his golden crown and do not want a general?
Why, Socrates, the reason is that my countrymen, the Ephesians, are the servants and soldiers of Athens, and do not need a general. And you and Sparta are not likely to have me, for you think that you have enough generals of your own.
My good Ion, did you never hear of Apollodorus of Cyzicus?
Who may he be?
One who, though a foreigner, has often been chosen their general by the Athenians. And there is Phanestheses of Andros, and Heraclides of Clazomenae, whom they have also appointed to the command of their armies and to other offices, although aliens, after they had shown their merit. And will they not choose Ion the Ephesian to be their general, and honour him if he prove himself worthy? Were not the Ephesians originally Athenians? And Ephesus is no mean city. But, indeed, Ion, if you are correct in saying that by art and knowledge you are able to praise Homer, you do not deal fairly with me. And after all your professions of knowing many glorious things about Homer, and promises that you would exhibit them, you are only a deceiver. And so far from exhibiting the art of which you are a master, will not, even after my repeated entreaties, explain to me the nature of it. You have literally as many forms as Proteus, and now you go all manner of ways, twisting and turning, and, like Proteus, become all manner of people at once, and at last slip away from me in the disguise of a general, in order that you may escape exhibiting your Homeric lore. And if you have art, then, as I was saying, in falsifying your promise that you would exhibit Homer, you are not dealing fairly with me. But if, as I believe, you have no art, but speak all these beautiful words about Homer unconsciously, under his inspiring influence, then I acquit you of dishonesty, and shall only say that you are inspired. Which do you prefer to be thought, dishonest or inspired?
There is a great difference, Socrates, between the two alternatives, and inspiration is by far the nobler.
Then, Ion, I shall assume the nobler alternative, and attribute to you in your praises of Homer inspiration, and not art.